My name's John Hennessy, one of the historians here at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. With me is Andrea Decoder. She is the most lettered of us all. She's the only one of us who has a PhD in history, as a matter of fact. So you have to listen especially carefully when she talks. And what we're going to do today is talk about the Red Badge of Courage and Chancellorsville. Now, let me ask, how many of you have read the Red Badge of Courage in your life? How many of you read it because you had to? How many of you read it in your own free will as adults? So a few of you have read it as adults. How many of you have never read the Red Badge of Courage at all? One of my hopes is, if we were measuring outcomes like the government likes to do, is that all of you who have never read Red Badge of Courage will want to go home and read it, because it is a powerful document. And those of you who haven't read it since your tormenting English teacher made you, will go back and read it once again. We're going to be walking narrow trails. We'll do our best to stay together. We don't have too large of a group, so it should be fairly easy, much easier than it has been. And we're very, very glad you're here. In these woods, 150 years ago yesterday, a man fell every second for 5.5 hours. It was perhaps the most intense, costly combat, the most intense, costly 5 hours of fighting in American history. Matching anything you've read about with the wheat field and on July 2nd at Gettysburg, matching the morning fighting at Antietam in intensity. But it was a confused, frightening landscape that historians struggle still to understand what went on in these woods. And it was these woods that Stephen Crane selected as his setting for this great novel. Now, when you read about the Civil War, and tonight, if any of you join us out at Fairview, we're going to talk a little bit about this and why we're here and what we do when we're here and these things. When you read about the Civil War, most of us read about courage. When the soldiers who survived this experience in these woods and on this battlefield wrote about the war, they wrote about courage. And they wrote and described the physical act of being in battle. Sometimes very vividly, as we will see, sometimes a little bit clumsily. But few of you read, and few soldiers who are here wrote about the other side of courage, which is fear. Stephen Crane's book is remarkable and important, not only in American history, American literary history, but in the history of the public's understanding of the Civil War, because he wrote unabashedly about fear. In fact, many people objected to the book. Veterans objected to the Red Badge of Courage because it portrayed soldiers gripped and reacting to fear. It portrayed cowards. It portrayed the protagonist, Henry Fleming, at times as a coward. And of course, the whole story of the book is the story of Henry Fleming facing his fears and ultimately, in the end, overcoming them. But courage and fear, and really fear, is at the heart of this book. Audie Murphy, who is the most decorated military man in American history, who played Henry Fleming in the 1950s version of the Red Badge of Courage, if any of you have ever seen that movie, who had seen combat equal to or beyond anything anyone in American history has seen, said that the Red Badge of Courage was the most authentic description of combat that he had ever seen. Stephen Crane was 24 years old when he wrote it. 24 years old. Never been in combat. He'd gone to school for a while in a military academy, but he had no military experience. And there were many who read this book and said it is impossible that he could have written. How could he know? And yet, they concluded almost universally that Stephen Crane knew. And he crafted a book that is maybe one of the top greatest 5 historical novels in American history. One of the great footnotes of Spotsylvania, those of you who live in Spotsylvania, if you were to name the top 5 historical novels in American history, Red Badge of Courage happened in Spotsylvania County. Roots happened in Spotsylvania County as well. Nobody pays much mind to that, of course, these days, which is too bad. But both were in fact said here. So imagine you've run into people in your life, I have, who have this ability to kind of just understand, who can put themselves in other people's eyes and feet and understand. They have empathy. They have an emotional understanding that many of us don't. And very clearly, Stephen Crane, who by the way died at the age of 30 years old, just 30 years old, had that kind of human insight. Now, Stephen Crane had a fondness for this part of Virginia. He was born in Newark, New Jersey, but he grew up in Port Jervis, New York, which if you have ever traveled Route 84, you cross the Delaware River on the New York border, and there's Port Jervis. He grew up there in Orange County, New York, and as a youth, he bumped elbows and listened to veterans of the Union Army. In fact, veterans from a specific regiment, the 124th New York, that lived in Port Jervis. And he later said, or one of his biographers later said, that this story of his was ruminating in his brain since his childhood. And at age 24, he wrote it. Now, Crane had a fondness for this part of Virginia. After he wrote Red Badge of Courage, he wrote a book called The Little Regiment, about a regiment fighting at the Battle of Fredericksburg. So he was very interested in this part of the world and often wrote of coming here. We don't know really whether he actually did come to Fredericksburg. But in the book, Crane did not tell us what battle he was talking about. In fact, he later said he purposely did not name the battle or provide a lot of specifics. You know why? Because he didn't want people like us trying to figure out and focus on the details and say, well, you got this wrong, you got that wrong, you got that wrong. Because, of course, in the post-war decades, the nation's memory of the Civil War was focused almost entirely on detail. You've seen the incredible documentation compiled at places like Gettysburg and Antietam. Detail, where we were, where we stood down to the foot, so we could erect a monument on the very spot. Crane wanted to avoid all that, so he never named the battle. Almost never named the battle. There are 3 geographic references in the book that hint, even if he didn't ultimately tell us, where this happened. One, he mentions the Rappahannock River by name. 2, he mentions a plank road. And of course, this was the plank road right out beside us. And 3rd, it's not a geographic reference, but he speaks heavily about the German soldiers in the Army. And of course, if any of you have been here for the weekend or the week so far, you know that the 11th Corps, which collapsed on May 2nd, 1863, was composed partly of German soldiers, and famously of German soldiers. But in a short story called The Veteran, one of the great pieces of writing about the Civil War, and one of the great pieces of writing that speaks to the impact of this war on these men through their lives. In that book, The Veteran, Crane tells the rest of Henry Fleming's story, or at the end of Henry Fleming's story. And in that, there's a young boy who asks Henry Fleming about his war experience. And he said, yes, that was at Chancellorsville. And so Crane himself ultimately gave it away. We probably would have figured it out anyway, because there's enough hints there. But Crane himself did. But we're not going to do what Crane didn't want us to do. We're not going to parse his book for for the historical details of the Battle of Chancellorsville. There's a good fit, a rough fit. It's not a perfect fit. I don't really care about that. We're going to look at the book, and we're going to kind of lay what Crane saw in his mind's eye down against what the men who were here saw with their eyes and described to us. And you'll see that some of the men who are here likewise strove mightily with their pens to describe what they saw here. Some of them succeed, none of them succeed like Crane succeeded, as we shall see. Stephen Crane, for the first time, took this war of panoramas and narrowed it down to a single face. And that, of course, is a method that's 100 years ahead of its time. We as historians really didn't start to do that. Bruce Catton started to do that in the 50s and the 60s. And now you can't read a book without that narrowed view down to the impact on individuals. I would say, a lot of the Civil War memoirs were important, and clearly, Crane read many of them. This is a book obviously based on tremendous research. But again, those memoirs focused on the physical act of being a soldier. Crane wanted what was inside these men. I would offer to you the difference between the memoirs of soldiers as it relates to the human experience and Crane's book is the difference between Gods and Generals and Saving Private Ryan. A totally different focus. For any of you who have endured Gods and Generals, I hope that, well, never mind. But let me just wrap up here and answer the question, why here? How do we know it was here? Not just Chancellorsville, but here that he was talking about. Well, for that, we will thank a couple of historians who have done some of what Crane didn't want them to do and try to figure out the origins of this story. One of them is a man from Orange County, New York, named Charles LaRocca. And he is quite certain that the experience of Henry Fleming mirrors almost precisely the experience of that hometown regiment that Henry Fleming knew, Stephen Crane knew as a child, the 124th New York. And then another fellow, Perry Lentz, who is at the University of Virginia, believes that Crane used another body of material from another group of soldiers, William H. French's division here of the 2nd Corps. But you know what? In the end, it doesn't matter because both the 124th New York and the men of French's division that Lentz believes Crane used as his basis ended up in almost the exact same patch of woods at the exact same climactic moment in the battle. So we don't have to resolve between the two. Instead, we are going to simply immerse ourselves into the environment that was Stephen Crane's mind's eye as he sat at a desk in New York City and wrote this book in 1894 and 1895. Do you have anything before we go?
John just gave us a brilliant introduction. There's really nothing to add. I just want to re-emphasize a point that he made earlier, that this book was provocative in its time, not just because it challenged some of the accounts of Civil War soldiers and their ideals of bravery, but because it helped to pioneer a literary movement. Now, John promised we wouldn't get all English teacher on you. Bear with me.
You have the PhD, so you have some allowances.
I won't tell you what the PhD stands for. But I just want to mention that Crane was a pioneer also as a part of a literary movement, realism. And so as we walk along, one of the things we're going to be doing today is sharing quotes with you from Crane's novel. And they're powerful in their simplicity and in how evocative they are. He calls it like he sees it, as John put it so well, in his mind's eye. And this was fairly shocking to people's sensibilities at the end of the 1800s. Remember, we're still in the Victorian era. We're coming out of novels like Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which, even when they attempted to be realistic, still romanticized the truth, still covered it in a way. And Crane doesn't do that. He lays it all bare, all the ugliness for people to see. And that's what was so shocking and provocative for people of that time. And today we're almost accustomed to that. Our lives have been, in a sense, Hollywoodized, where we expect to see something gory. That was not the case in Crane's time. And for somebody who was born after the Civil War, it was even more provocative, especially, again, to these Civil War veterans. So keep that in mind as we're reading some of these quotes. Being in the place is powerful enough, but just thinking about how people may have reacted when they read this material for the first time and read about some of the very gory things that these men experienced on these battlefields, things which had been largely left unsaid, except in some very private soldiers' accounts. So this is very powerful material indeed.
All right, as we go along, if you can't hear us, just raise your hand and just give us a signal that we need to talk louder, and we will. But right now we're going to go down here and hang a left and start on our journey. Please let them know that it's there.
We need to qualify that?
Well, it's almost akin to giving you permission to check people out, but that's not what I mean, of course. If we could slide down maybe 10 spaces, everyone will get in here and we'll be good. There are some evil people in the front of this. Are there any English teachers on the there are? All these evil people thought that we're going to quiz you at the end of this. Was not my idea, of course. Fitting the story of the Red Badge of Courage into a single unit, a single regiment, is impossible. I think Crane selected from all the accounts that he read that pertain to this place and this time, or all the accounts that he heard, the ones that helped him the most. And so he just kind of piled them in to a pot to create his characters, to create his setting, to create his story. Henry Fleming was in a new unit that had yet to fight. There were many such regiments out here. You'll encounter one tomorrow if you take Don Fonz's tour, Union Footsteps, tomorrow afternoon. He will also be talking about a regiment that had never been in battle before. So that was not that unusual in the Union Army. It's interesting that Crane selected as the setting for most of his book the gloomiest, most confining, most frightening environment that was the setting for any of the Civil War's major battles. The wilderness of Spotsylvania. I know you think of it in terms of the Battle of the Wilderness, several miles to our west, but in fact the wilderness was a geographic area that encompassed most of the Chancellorsville battlefield. It was an area that had been deeply cultivated for tobacco in the 18th century, and then later was not recovered, and so it was a place of sporadic settlement. It was a place where there were a couple of iron furnaces that thrived, and so they used tremendous amounts of fuel. And of course, when you cut trees down, what happens? They grow back. So the wilderness was not just one thing, it was a lot of things. It was woods like this. It was woods that were 20 years old, 15 feet tall, 5 feet apart, impossible to see. It was all of those things. But for soldiers, fighting in the woods, other than fighting in the dark, fighting in the woods was the most difficult, frightening thing to do. Although panoramas in battle were themselves daunting, the woods themselves hid surprises right in front of you. And that is something that Crane would use as well in his book. One soldier described this place. He said, "It was a wild, weird region. Everywhere was a dense and trackless forest. No other idea of the country can be given that it was a forest apparently without limit, with clearings so few and their space so contracted as scarcely to be considered as breaking the monotony of tree and undergrowth." In the Red Badge of Courage, Crane writes this. He really, at times, the forest here, the environment here, is a character in the book. virtually. He says, sometimes the brambles formed chains and tried to hold the boy back. Trees confronting him stretched out their arms and forbade him to pass. This resistance of the forest filled him with fine bitterness, Crane wrote of his protagonist, Henry Fleming. In the book, the forests take on a horrific character, a horrific life. And so too did they during the fighting in these woods on May 3rd, 1863. Here's a description written by one of the Confederates who advanced right through the area where we are now. The woods in which we had fought them were very thick. The trees were old and seasoned, and the ground was covered with dry leaves. The shells exploding ignited them, and soon a terrific fire was burning. We always think of fires in connection with the Battle of the Wilderness, but there were horrific fires at Chancellorsville as well. To extinguish it was beyond the power of man. Every exertion was made to clear away the leaves from around the wounded. But in many cases this could not be done. And as the flames would reach them, helpless to escape, they would in trembling accents utter the heart-rending cry of fire. The scene defies description. The air was impregnated, and my heart sickens at the vivid recollection. That was a letter written less than 2 weeks after the battle itself. Now, the Red Badge of Courage narrates 2 days of fighting. Nominally May 2nd, although he never says that, of course, and May 3rd. And on May 2nd, on the first day in the Red Badge of Courage, Henry Fleming enters battle for the first time. He is racked with anxiety, fueled by excitement, and then, of course, he fails. He fails. He runs away. Now, one of the distinctive aspects of Red Badge of Courage are these bald-faced, raw descriptions of men, Union soldiers. Remember, the nation in 1895 was run by former Union soldiers. They were the dominant demographic in American politics, industry, and business. And to portray one of them as a coward, well, you know how it would be accepted today or during World War II. It's a difficult thing for the public to accept, and it certainly was at that time. During the Civil War, soldiers almost never, very rarely described cowardice in themselves or a failure of courage in themselves, but they often described it in others. And here at Chancellorsville, the failure, the collapse of others was described vividly. One man wrote, this is writing about the 11th Corps retreat from the battlefield. He said he was not in the 11th Corps, he was watching. He said, after a short halt, we marched across the field toward the forest where we witnessed a sight that defies description. It was the panic and stampede of the 11th Corps. They were coming from the woods in our front and fleeing across the field toward us. Their retreat was headlong. They had thrown away everything that was loose, guns, knapsacks, caps, and many had no coat and blouse and were in their shirt sleeves. They were crazed and would fight to escape as though the enemy were close to them. We were ordered to stop them, but we might as well try to stop a cyclone. They dived through our line, regardless of our guns or bayonets. And soon the fugitives had all gone through our line, greatly to our relief, for their panic was nerve-wracking to troops new in the service. And of course, Crane expresses that same sentiment in his book. He includes in his book the flight of Henry Fleming for the first time. And it's one of the most vivid passages and probably one of the most controversial passages in the book. One of the first public descriptions of a Union soldier running away from battle. You want to read that?
Sure.
You got it?
Yep. Now, as John mentioned, Fleming is not part of the 11th Corps per se, but what he's experiencing would have been very similar to what the 11th Corps faced. Here's Crane's passage. As the Confederates came on, the youth began to exaggerate the endurance, the skill, and the valor of those who were coming. He was astonished beyond measure at such persistency. They must be machines of steel. It was very gloomy, struggling against such affairs. A lad whose face had borne the expression of exalted courage, the majesty of he who dares to give his life, was, at an instant, smitten abject. He blanched like one who has come to the edge of a cliff at midnight and is suddenly made aware. He too threw down his gun and fled. There was no shame on his face. He ran like a rabbit. His rifle and cap were gone. His unbuttoned coat bulged in the wind. The flap of his cartridge box bobbed wildly, and his canteen by its slender cord swung out behind. On his face was all the horror of those things which he imagined. Since the youth had turned his back upon the fight, his fears had been wondrously magnified. Death about to thrust him between his shoulder blades was far more dreadful than death about to smite him between the eyes. The noises of the battle were like stones. He believed himself liable to be crushed.
So Crane catches one thing you read about all the time, and I think we experience in our own lives when we're confronted with something, whether it be in business or in sports. I remember when I played high school and college football, we were pretty good, but every time the other team came out on the field, and they're very cool and clean uniforms, and they did very cool and clean and crisp warm-up exercises, we thought they were like machines. And you always, at that key moment, accord to the other strength that they do not have, and they to you as well. And it is that presumption of greater strength, which is often only momentary, that sometimes inspires men to quaver at moments like this. We're going to continue down this. Yeah, good for you. So you know this story. You want to take a stop?
So you listen to many times?
Well, it's, one of the... on the one hand, it's a disadvantage that we only have one trail through the woods. I mean, it's the only way to get through here. If we're going to talk about this end of the field in more than one way, we have to use the same path. But on the other hand, it's kind of neat to see the same ground through different lenses sometimes.
But our brains only take in, 20% of... So I need to hear it again.
Okay, very good.
Too much of...
7%. Everybody okay? All right. Well, yesterday they brought a big sound system out here. We had it ready to go depending on how big the crowd is, but we felt we could do this one with our voices, which is much better, I think. So right behind us over here, just beyond these, and you'll get a chance to see them as we go out, is a low mound of dirt. It is the remnant of earthworks that were built here on May 2nd and May 3rd, 1863. In fact, the Union Army built them first, and then when the Confederate Army drove the Yankees away from here, they would eventually adapt them and reface them, it's called, point them in the other direction. In other words, dig the trench on the other side. The earthworks at Chancellorsville were not the finely engineered things you'll see later in the war at Petersburg or at Spotsylvania. Here in these woods, they were haphazard affairs. Now this line of works that we're going to walk along here, when it was a Union line of works, represents a tangible response to the attack of Thomas Jonathan Jackson's men on the 2nd of May, 1863. Up until Jackson's attack, the Union Army was oriented in this direction, because that's where the Confederates were and were presumed to be, and presumed where they would be, was facing south and to the east. The Rappahannock River is off, and the Rappahannock is off to my left as I'm pointing here, and the Union Army ran from pretty close to the river up to Chancellorsville, and then facing south along Route 3 to the west. But when Jackson's men attacked on the evening of May 2nd, they came not from this direction, but they came from this direction. And so this army that was facing this way, and these soldiers that were facing this way, the first thing they saw were those tumbling, frightened men of the 11th Corps coming back toward them from this direction. And then they could at least perceive the Confederates not far behind them. And so the Union Army, as the sun went down on May 2nd, rushed to face from this direction to also face in this direction. Because remember, there were still Confederates over there too. So now you've got Union lines here at Chancellorsville almost back to back, within a few hundred yards. Some facing that way, and these men here facing this way. That night, the soldiers started hacking and cutting trees. They started digging with whatever they had in their hands, their bayonets. Most of them didn't have spades at this point. Digging earthworks on battlefields was not really a refined art. It wasn't even necessarily commanded. It was taken upon spontaneously by men who wanted to save their own lives. And the earthworks that were here were probably not much higher than was necessary for a man to sleep behind or to lie behind. They were not the powerful chest-high things that you'll see at Spotsylvania. They were logs with some dirt thrown up upon them. One man wrote, "Axes and shovels were furnished, and we were soon hard at work. To most of us, this was an unfamiliar effort. But before our service ended, it was one in which we became proficient. There was a lot of fallen timber that we gathered and placed lengthwise. Then we dug a trench behind, and the dirt was thrown over the logs. The trench was over 2 feet deep, wide enough for the line to stand in. And with the embankment, the total depth was about 5 feet, so about that high, going down 2 and up 3 is the way that it worked. These works were quite strong and would protect the men against attack, for an ordinary projectile could not go through the embankment." Now those works are stronger than most. They're probably stronger than these. These works were built just on the other side of the turnpike. Now when Henry Fleming arrived in Stephen Crane's mind's eye into these woods on this day, his Union soldiers, Crane and his fellow soldiers, their regiment started to do the exact same thing, and here is Crane's description of it. "During this halt, many men in the regiment began erecting tiny hills in front of themselves. They used stones, sticks, earth, anything that might turn a bullet. Some built comparatively large ones, while others seemed content with little ones. This procedure caused a discussion among the men. Some wished to fight like duelists, believing it to be correct to stand erect and be, from their feet to their foreheads, a mark. But the others scoffed in reply and pointed to the veterans on the flanks who were digging at the ground like terriers. In a short time, there was quite a barricade along the regimental fronts." And in fact, that perspective on earthworks early in the war, you don't see earthworks on the war's early battlefields like at First Manassas. And so here, on the night of May 2nd, into the early morning of May 3rd, with a nearly full moon, with Stonewall Jackson falling to Union fire out in front of us here, this was the line that Jackson was riding toward when he came out here, returned, and then was shot upon by his own men as he returned to the Confederate lines that night. That night, the men, after about 2 or 3 hours of tumultuous firing in the woods, here and there at Fairview and all over, finally, probably about 1 o'clock, the battlefield went relatively quiet out here, and men slept, knowing that the battle would begin with the first light the next morning. To me, it's amazing. Now, let me point something out about being a Civil War soldier. We have this image of men inured to combat, as if it was a common thing. But in the course of a year, in 1862 or 1863, in the course of a year, how many hours do you think a typical soldier might be actually under fire in combat? How many days? How long? Weeks?
Probably no more than 18 hours.
18 hours. Probably between 8 and 12 hours. Actually in combat, actually firing his weapon, actually in physical danger from small arms fire from the enemy. And more than 90% of men who fell in Civil War battles fell because of small arms fire. So I point that out to you because to suggest in any way that this experience would become routine based on 8 or 10 or 12 hours a year of being under fire is just untrue. Veterans had been under fire sometimes. They were veterans by virtue of a few hours in combat. And any of us who have a few hours of anything would hardly consider ourselves inured to its dangers. And you can be sure that these men were not. Yes?
From our read about all this stuff, that most of the time was spent either marching or drudgery.
That's right. A tremendous amount of time spent on the road, far more in camp. The drudgery, the tedium of life of Civil War soldiers was immense. We get a payoff for that because one of the things they did to fill that time was write letters. And so we have thousands of letters written not just about battles but about everyday life, and we know an immense amount because of it. But these men who took their places in these trenches, looking out into these woods, having cut down most of the trees right in front of the earthworks here, knew what was going to come the next morning. And they were not accustomed to it. These men had been in battle before, but this was a frightening experience. And yet I'm always amazed that they slept. And it is a testament to the physical arduousness of being a soldier that these men were able to sleep almost whenever they got the opportunity to do it. And so they slept. One soldier wrote, "This night was one of toil, trouble, danger, and watchfulness for our army. The night was beautiful and clear. The moon shone brightly, but the heavy forest above our heads cast a heavy gloom. All would be still and calm one moment, then crack would go a gun, followed by many others." Henry Fleming awoke here on the morning of, in Crane's mind's eye, May 3rd, in works that were not unlike these. He said about him, of course he's writing in the third person, Crane does write about Henry Fleming. About him were the rows and groups of men that he had dimly seen the previous night. The gaunt, careworn features and dusty figures were made plain by this quaint light at the dawning, but it dressed the skin of the men in corpse-like hues, and made the tangled limbs appear pulseless and dead. People don't write like this anymore. It's just okay. The youth stirred it up with a little cry when his eyes first swept over this motionless mass of men, thick spread on the ground, pallid and in strange postures. His disordered mind interpreted the hall of the forest as a charnel place. He did not dare to move lest these corpses start up, squalling and squawking. In a second, however, he achieved his proper mind. He swore a complicated oath at himself. He saw that his somber picture was not a fact of the present, but a mere prophecy. And of course what he was seeing was men not dead, but sleeping all around him. Another almost chilling parallel, the descriptions of the sunrise on May 3rd, 1863 are many and vivid. It was apparently a very beautiful sunrise. It was a Sunday morning, May 3rd was. One soldier over near Fairview wrote, "I saw in the east the sun just coming over the forest. Never was there a more beautiful sunrise. Not a cloud in the sky. It was an ideal Sunday morning, warm and fair. It seemed to me like sacrilege that such a sacred day should be used by men to kill and maim each other." Stephen Crane narrated the same moment. In his mind's eye, perhaps even the same sunrise. As Henry, as the boy, gazed around him, the youth felt a flash of astonishment at the blue, pure sky and the sun beaming on the trees and fields. It was surprising that nature had gone tranquilly on with her golden process in the midst of so much devilment. So exactly the same sentiment from one who was here and one who imagined that he was here. Shortly after dawn, on May 3rd, 1863, the Confederates would start forward through these woods toward us here. And the fighting would erupt around where we are now. In this moment of the onset of battle, imagine the onset of battle, when you know that it's coming and that your fears could well be justified at any instant by random arrival of a bullet, and you watch the men around you begin to fall. Crane described this moment in his book. Someone cried, "Here they come!" The man at the youth's elbow was mumbling as if to himself, "Oh, we are in for it now! We are in for it now!" I have an account of a soldier at the Second Battle of Manassas, where at the opening of the battle, the Confederates are coming upon his regiment. And the man next to him writes a letter home and says that this man hunkered down along the fence, looked over the fence, watching the Confederates come, and he just said over and over, he said, "Come on, goddamn you. Come on, goddamn you." So this sense of foreboding, this verbalization of what they were feeling was common. Perspiration streamed down the youth's face, which was soiled like that of a weeping urchin. He frequently, with a nervous movement, wiped his eyes with his coat sleeve. His mouth was still a little way open. He got one glance at the foe swarming in front of him. He threw the obedient, well-balanced rifle into position and fired a first wild shot. Directly, he was working his weapon like an automatic affair. And in the book, and in these woods, it became a swirling maelstrom as the Confederates surged forward against these earthworks here. And eventually, they would collapse the Union line along this position here. And the Yankees, Union troops, would stream back through the woods. The battle was by no means over. And then, at this moment in time in Crane's book, Henry Fleming is actually a little bit behind these lines. But this collapse of this line here will create the setting for the climactic moment in Crane's book. Any questions? Yes?
I'm just trying to, in my mind's eye, picture this woods as it was then. Would it look pretty much like this? Or was it trees?
Again, the wilderness was a lot of different things, and these woods were probably fairly open.
Yeah.
Now, mind you, when the Yankees built their earthworks here, when they cut the trees down in order to make the log works, they took all the brush and put it out in front. So there was an open space in front that was covered with this brush, which was very difficult for the Confederates ultimately to get through. It's a structure or method called abattis, and it's meant to retard the advance of an army. It helped a little bit, but obviously didn't change the outcome here.
It just slows them down, that's all it does.
Slows them down, that's right.
So do you believe that his book is based on this kind of setting here, or perhaps more like a flank attack?
No, well, there's elements of both of it in there. Clearly, the panic is analogous to the flank attack, but he takes Henry Fleming and puts him in that attack, not as a witness to it, but as a participant in it. He doesn't describe it as it was Jackson's flank attack, but he creates that moment. So Crane just takes little bits of parts of this battle, and he takes Henry Fleming and puts it in where it suits him best to tell the story. So it's not an unbroken, accurate historical narrative of the Battle of Chancellorsville. Instead, it's a narrative that has immense parallels to Chancellorsville, but can't be taken as an attempt to duplicate the battle in any way.
It's not literal.
Not literal. Except, in Crane's mind's eye, it was literal.
And at this location, how close did the Confederates get before the Union guys fell back? Like
Most combat in the Civil War was waged at ranges up to 150 yards. So that's when the shooting would start. Maybe even longer than that. Now the limiting thing here was how far could you see in the woods. It depends on how some places in the woods you can see 20 yards. I mean, if you all look off in that direction, you can't see 30 yards in the woods in that direction. But back where we were at the last place, you could see 50, and these woods were just like that. And then the line here actually would collapse from left to right. It wouldn't collapse because of these men overawing the works here. It collapsed up by the road and started tumbling back in this direction. All right, down the road this way.